is something tons of people do. They'll love to. And you'll even read this crap in camera books. But here's where you got it wrong in the camera books, and even all these YouTube schmucks have got it wrong. They're I'm going to take a shot, I'm going to bracket my shots, you know, and you take it in bracket mode, take 3-shot bracket, meaning 2 around perfect exposure, or 5-shot, which is 4 around perfect exposure, 2 above, 2 below. Wonderful. What is so important about ETTR, which means exposed to the right, which means you're actually squeezing every bit of saturation dynamic range of your camera as possible. Here's a really key important point. Now someone will do like let's say a 5-shot bracket. It's like, wow, I've only exposed for the highlights and the shadows are totally in the black. And that's fine. If you want the shot to look like that, that's fine. But here's why you should try to consider doing bracketing as little as possible. If you're exposing all the way to the right, you can make all of those shots look like what you want it to look like. If you saturated the sensor to the point where you're not clipping your shadows, which is exposing all the way to the right, what you're doing is you're gaining something really important. It's called shadow fidelity. If, however, you plan on just taking that shot and bracketing it, and then if you want it to look like that underexposed shot where basically anything is valid in composition, if you want it to look mostly dark, that's perfectly fine. The point is, if you wanted to bring those shadows out, you can't do it. The shadow fidelity is gone. There's not enough signal to noise ratio, and the shadows on the bracketed shots that you've taken, and what you've done is you've not only you've taken some shots that are invalid, but you're working off the premise that what you see is what you get, and that's what, you know, if you're working with JPEGs, then you're right. Go ahead with bracketing because you're screwed. You know, this is the really, really important reason to be shooting RAW. However, the best thing to do is actually shoot RAW plus fine. You use the fine image for previewing, for increased speed and workflow and previewing your images. Shadow fidelity is lost in the underexposed bracketed shot. Say 2 stops underneath what correct TTL would be the composition you're looking for. What you could actually do is expose all the way to the right, and you'll have far fewer shadows than you want, but you just drag it into Lightroom or whatever editing program you want and actually increase your shadow range up to whatever point you want on the scale of the dynamic range of the shot. But when you do that bracketing and you've lost all the fidelity in the shadows, then the recoverability goes not only 1 down to next to nothing depending on the value for the shadows, but also 2, the fidelity of your specular highlights is not exposed as far as it possibly could be by not bringing it to full saturation, not clipping it, but bringing it up to the limit before it actually clips. This is also why it's really important feature to have a light meter for landscape photography, and especially for studio work. It's actually important, but that's a matter for another discussion. But shadow fidelity is lost, and also too, you've not actually saturated. Now, flash photography is another matter. We're talking about ambient lighting photography. But people just don't seem to get that. Now, if you're a JPEG shooter, you know, this video is not applicable to you. I hope to God you don't have a really expensive camera and are just shooting JPEGs. Even if you don't want to shoot RAW, you should still be shooting RAW. And what's the reason for that? Because in the future, if you try to progress your skills at all and learn about photography, you're going to realize that, oh my God, I shot all these JPEGs, but now I don't have any RAW files that I can actually sit, now that I've learned how to use Lightroom and Photoshop, learned how to manipulate in Lightroom or Photoshop. You have a gigantic cookie jar of possibilities open to you with a RAW file that you sure as hell don't have with a JPEG. But bracketing and shooting in RAW is not really the best. It's actually not even a valid choice, because you could drag any file that you want, and if you want to drop the shadows and even the midtones into the dirt, and the only thing that actually shows up in the entire composition is your specular highlights, that is super easy to do in Lightroom or Photoshop. But if you bracket your shot and it's like, well, I underexposed by 3 stops, but this is the composition that I wanted. It really isn't, and the reason for that is if you want all your shadow detail gone, that's fine. But by underexposing by 3 stops, you didn't only just underexpose your shadows, you underexposed everything by 3 stops. So your shadows fell into the shit can, gone forever. There's no detail there recoverable at all. raw or otherwise. But also you also underexposed your specular highlights. You know, the stuff that you did want to correctly expose for by 3 stops. Because an underexposure is an underexposure. Underexposure doesn't mean you're just underexposing the shadow. Well, I want to underexpose, you know. I want the midtones and the shadows to fall to black, and the only thing I want highlighted is the highlights. Well, that's fine if that's what the composition and the shot calls for that you see in your brain that you want to manifest in your camera, but that's not the way you should be going about it. By, oh, I'm just going to throw it on bracketing, and then I'm going to bracket some pictures. Whichever one looks the best. That's what the hell raw files are for. Just remember that if you don't want the shadow detail at all, that's fine, but by underexposing, you're also underexposing your highlights, meaning you're losing saturation, tonality, and details, and this is really important in black and white photography. You're losing all of that by underexposing, period. That's the really key thing. If this were a real fireplace and I just wanted the fire only to show up, I wanted the logs and everything else to fall to black, that's fine, but if I underexpose it by 3 stops, everything is underexposed by 3 stops. Which doesn't matter for the shadows and the midtones, but it also means that the highlights, the thing you're exposing for, is also underexposed, which means less tonality, which means less saturation, which means less detail. This is why ETTR, i.e. exposed to the right, is so incredibly important. 2 words you've probably not heard on any other photography channel. Shadow fidelity. Shadow fidelity. ETTR gives you that. Flash photography gives you that even better, however. But alright, that's it. Thanks so much for watching. Catch you later. Hasta luego. And goodbye. Ba-dum, 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 ba-dum.